So I wanted to talk a little bit about your parents and ancestors. So your parents' names were?
Carol and Catherine. Catherine well, her mother was a Pfeiffer. The Pfeiffer family settled in Albany, Oregon in 1848 and ran the Revere House. And her mother, Irma, died when Catherine was in high school. And Floyd E. Doris, her father, then remarried to Barbara Buxton. He was a preacher, Presbyterian preacher, and married my parents, as you saw the documentation. And the Doris family goes way back. There's Doris, California, which became Alturas. There's Doris Bridge. And you saw the basket was given to James Doris, who was the manager of the Modoc Indian Reservation. And the Modocs gave him this nice basket, which we have.
How did that come about that he was the manager?
I have no idea.
Huh.
I have no record as to how that happened. I'd like to know more. I've looked up the Modoc Indians and Alturas and others, and have never found any story attached to his being in that position. But they were clearly, the Dorises were clearly good early pioneers into Northern California. And Doris and Doris Bridge, Doris became Alturas because the post office didn't care to have two Dorises.
Sure.
And, but Doris Bridge is still there, at least the bridge is still there, and I presume the town is. Yeah. So they came over Mount Hood, and one of the Doris family, or Pfeiffer family probably, died on Mount Laurel, in the slopes of Mount Hood. There's a sign somewhere marking that gravesite. And
you said that was an avalanche.
no, they just an accident in a wagon train. And then the Williams side came a couple years later, but they decided that they did not want to go that long trip down to the upper Columbia and then have to take a boat to Portland, then take the wagon trains to Eugene and Dexter, where they were to meet up with friends. So they took it's called the Elliott Cutoff, which was a disastrous cutoff, and it's quite famous. And finally, the Parvins went out, and others went out and found them in the fall, and got them into Dexter. But then they had, of course, no place to live, so they had to be taken care of until spring, where they could build a house. And so the family, my grandfather married Parvin, and then she died, and so he married the daughter. So there are two Parvins in the family, and there's a Parvin Butte in Dexter, and there's the Parvin Covered Bridge.
Sure.
So the Williams family had a home and a ranch in Dexter attached to the Williams General Store, which my grandfather was the proprietor. My dad worked there. My dad was the first to go to college. Others of his family, his brothers went too, his sister went too. He went to University of Oregon and graduated in economics. And while there, met Catherine. And she graduated and then went on, I don't know what her major was. Then she went to University of Washington and got her major in library science. And then lived in Dexter. And she ended up driving a big pickup truck, taking to town, picking up groceries and stuff for the thing. And these trucks were tough. They had to be started by hand crank, and they're tough things to do. It was amazing she could do it. And they lived in a small house around back of the grocery store. it's still there. She finally convinced Dad that that moving Eugene would be a better life. She wasn't terribly happy given her background living in Dexter.
Okay.
Didn't envision herself, being a farm woman the rest of her life.
Mm-hmm.
And a close friend of his offered him a job at Connecticut Mutual. He had just started this firm in Eugene, so Dad took him up on that.
Mm-hmm.
And that became pretty much a lifelong career. And so he built a house in Eugene. We lived there 5 years. So I was only a year old, probably, when we moved to Eugene.
Okay.
And David would have been, well, 5 years
5
old
years
or so.
old, okay.
Yeah. And I went to kindergarten there, and then the recession and war. In other words, the people weren't buying life insurance. I don't know if you call it a recession, but the war came on. And before the war, of course, it really was a recession. And so he moved the family. Mother had a duplex on Montgomery Street in Portland, Montgomery and I can't think of the main street, up Broadway, Montgomery and Broadway.
How did that come about that she had a house?
I don't have the answer to that, but she had family money, and she had other parts of the building.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to stand up here. I just want to make sure I've got a good level still. Go ahead.
She owned another apartment building in town too. So it was a duplex, so we moved the family out of the first floor duplex and we moved in. It sits, one of Portland State University's buildings sits on the property. Our duplex is gone, long gone.
Mhm.
And I went to Shattuck, which was just up the street, which is now part of Portland State University, and David went to Grant High School, which was the primary building for Portland State University, right? So one direction David went to school, and the other I went within 2 blocks.
Okay.
And he went to Lincoln High School while I was in grade school, or in the first grade. We stayed there a year or two, I don't remember how long, and then we moved to Irvington Street, Thompson and Irvington, in northeast Portland, or the Irvington district. And I went to Irvington grade school, and he went to Grant High School, which was a little further away, but he liked that school very much. And then Bernie, his brother, Bernie Williams, asked if he would like to work for him in San Francisco, being a regional salesman for sporting wear. That's socks, underwear, whatever. And I'm for the Southwest. And Dad was very attracted to the idea, so we moved first to Green Street in San Francisco, right next to Lowell High School, which David went to Lowell and graduated from Lowell. And I went to a grade school in, I suppose, 6th grade, which wasn't terribly great, but it was just another block away. Schools were nice to have, convenient. And then we found a house in the Richmond district, 3800 Rich Geary, which was about 8 blocks from the beach, but cloudy most of the year. The Richmond and Sunset districts in San Francisco get high clouds almost the whole year round. And I went to then to Presidio Junior High, and David stayed at Lowell and graduated from Lowell. And then I moved to George Washington High School, which was just across the street from Presidio Junior High. And then Eisenhower recession hit, and sales for sporting wear went out, and people weren't wearing Ariel socks anymore. They were all wearing black socks or whatever, and so there wasn't any inventory to sell. So Dad decided to move back to Portland. I should say, when we moved to Eugene originally, Dad worked at the shipyards, as he was an asbestoser. Luckily, he never came down with the asbestos disease, thank God, but he did that during the war. Yeah. So we moved back to Portland in early 50s, and then I went to Lincoln High School. Moving high schools is very difficult because it gets very clannish, and Lincoln High was especially so.
You moved an awful lot in your
Yeah, a lot
childhood.
of schools,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
And David then was already at Reed, because he was going to Reed while we were in San Francisco. And so I got some exposure to Reed, some of his friends, and one or two I still stay in touch with. Alan Keeney's one primary.
Right.
And so he lived at, I was trying to think where he lived during that time, and when we were back in Portland, he may have lived on campus. I'm really not sure how that worked, but when
But you were still at home at that point.
yeah, oh yeah,
right?
I stayed in home quite a long time. First, I went to Lincoln High School and I found a job after work picking up and delivering film from Byers Color Lab. I had David's old car I bought from a Willie's sedan and a stick shift car.
Mhm.
So I'd pick up the film at the lab and deliver it to these various photo stores or other establishments that marketed that product, and picked up film to be processed and took it into the lab. And then I found a full-time job, and I met a friend of mine, Bill Nordstrom, who got me into the environmental movement, who was working at Byers Color Lab, and got me into backpacking, hiking, Trails Club of Oregon, and that started my career.
This is just late high school. This is starting. Right?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, and then I got a job as in Paul Giese ad crafters. They basically artists would draw the ads they wanted, and the ad crafters would set the type and set the ad up. You know, the old stick type, setting the letters,
Mhm.
and they had liner types too. But the headlines all had to be done by hand, and so that was delivering, picking up that, that sort of thing. And I got a job at J.C. Penney's washing dishes, which reminded me of a routine of the poor soul, Jackie Gleason. The restaurant, it was sort of a cafeteria almost, but sit-down tables, had a belt that brought the dirty dishes into the kitchen. And when they were really busy, they came in faster than I could load them into the dishwasher. So they would start sliding onto the floor, and I'd turn off the belt. And usually within 30 seconds, the manager would come in and shout, "Who turned off that belt?" Well, they had me loading the dishes and then unloading them, which is terrible, really against health standards. Well, I didn't know any better.
Sure.
But it made $125 an hour, so and that was part of the job. The other part was keeping the bakery supplied, and it was up on the third floor of this J.C. Penney's building. But they had a belt that took from the loading dock that took the flour and sugar and stuff up. So I went down and picked up this stuff and put it on the belt and flicked the switch. Nothing happened. Belt wouldn't move unless it was empty. So these 75-pound bags of flour and sugar and so forth, I'd get the belt moving, then put them on the conveyor belt, then dash up 3 stories and catch them before they fell on the floor and broke.
That's great.
Not my favorite job.
No.
Then I worked for the Reed College bookstore for a while, which started at Reed College, then became independent. It was basically supplying books to distributors around Los Angeles, San Francisco, and so forth. Basically typing orders and packing books, which was not a hell of a lot of fun. And from there, I went to school, night school, and But because I'm dyslexic, school's always been difficult.
When did you discover that something was going on? When did you know
Well,
that something?
I only knew it maybe when I was senior in high school or something, but,
Did you know what it was by that time?
well, some doctor finally said this is what it is. People didn't know what
Sure.
dyslexia was, so I have no idea.
And Liz talks about the fact that she, spent time when you were in the discovery process of this here with you. I mean, that's what she remembers.
Yeah,
About
yeah.
you having really coming to terms with that and
Right.
overcoming. Yeah.
It was difficult because of that learning disability. I was shut out of most extracurricular activities
Sure.
in school.
Yes.
I couldn't. That's one reason I became involved in the Junior Red Cross. It was outside of the school
Mm-hmm.
circuit, and I could get involved in that. And but generally, it was difficult. And college was equally difficult. I eventually got 2 years of college, a lot of it night school. I joined the Air Force Reserves, mainly to stay out of Vietnam. It was starting to build,
Mm-hmm.
and so that meant 1 weekend a month plus a camp, summer camp. So it took a lot of my vacation time,
Mhm.
1 week summer camp in Boise, Idaho. So that I got called up in the Bay of Pigs, and for a month on the air base, because they activated military
Sure,
all over the
sure.
country. And after that, they let us. They forgave us the rest. I didn't do the full 6 years after we called up for a month.
What did that involve for you, being called up? Anything in particular?
Well, I had a job. I got a job at Omark Industries, which makes saw chain for chainsaws, and invented the saw chain, the design of the modern saw chain. And one day I was working there, and the next day I was in the Air Force. But they were good enough. I was working in the shipping department there, and they were fine. And I got my job back when I came back, as the law requires that.
Where did they send you when you said?
Just the Portland Air Base.
Okay,
So
they just had you
commuted.
on active alert, basically.
Yeah, and I just commuted from home.
Mhm.
I had my Vespa, and I just drive to and from. And then I got a job opening happened in the advertising department at Omark, and I got a job in their department shipping advertising supplies to the various stores and our salesmen around the country. And I eventually ended up in a private office in Omark, going to trade shows in Chicago. And in fact, I got to a trade show in Chicago just as the McCormick Place burned down, and, which was a major disaster. And, but our trade show material wasn't in the convention center, so they set it up somewhere else. One time I had a major speech to give, or at least speech to give, to, I think it was a Portland Rotary Club, a fairly influential bunch, on the Redwood, big controversy, because Georgia Pacific's headquarters is in Portland, and they were the main culprits in trying to cut the redwoods. And so I was fairly outspoken on that, being I was active in the Sierra Club.
Okay, and this was some of your first active, being really active in that environmental?
Well, no, but in this particular story, I couldn't give the speech because I had to go to Northern California for a trade show selling Oregon saw chain.
Seems sort of ironic.
It's ironic, wasn't it? Yes, yes. But my first encounter with the conservation movement was we used to go out Friday night and hike over to Bagby Hot Springs, which is still very much beloved. And you
Where's
hike
this,
in.
where's this close to?
It's in the Cascades, south of Portland.
Okay.
And then it was about, when I knew it, a 4-mile hike in. It was prior to that an 8-mile hike through a cathedral-like trees and river valley. It was absolutely magnificent. And they had cedar logs hollowed out, and they had a bathhouse, and we'd open up the spigot and this hot water would come in, fill up the cedar logs. You have to go down to the creek and pour cold water, get cold water,
Make
cool it down. And we always had the place to ourselves, so very few people wanted to hike that far in, and we'd spend the weekend there. And then one time hiking in, we noticed that bulldozers were starting to cut up the trail, and we went to visit the ranger in charge of that area in Portland, and he claimed, well, they weren't going any further, and they were, and we went back the next week, and they'd gone a bit further and had a sign up that says, we're going to, but we will not enter Bagby Hot Springs. So they were going to build it right up,
Wow.
practically the edge of it, which that kind of access would be a real problem in maintenance. And besides, you're cutting down some gorgeous.
Right, and this was all in an effort to get people closer to the springs?
No,
or-
it was an effort to get the trees.
Just to get the trees, that's
Oh,
all
yeah,
they really
that was all
after.
it's about. No,
Okay.
it had nothing to do with recreation.
Gotcha, okay.
Basically, to get those huge trees out.
Mhm.
And we made a big stink about it, and they backed off, and the hike now is, I don't know, maybe 2 miles. I'm not quite sure how long it is, but and they then put the road around the back of a mountain or a hill,
Hmm.
and got it away from the hot springs. But that was my first interaction with government, let's say.
And some
Yeah.
success with it.
Oh yeah, we had
So-
some success, and I always thought making change is like eating peanuts. Once you learn you can do it, then it's fun to keep trying.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I continued to do a lot. I backpacked in the summer, skied in Mount Hood in the winter. Trails Club had a lodge in Mount Hood and also on the Columbia Gorge. So we go skiing in Mount Hood in the winter, and this was dirt cheap because it was just a few dollars to stay overnight. You got dinner and breakfast because the members cooked, shared cooking. And then in the spring and fall, I had a kayak, we'd kayak, and get out. So we were out most of the year doing something or other. And that's how my conservation work started. And then in 1965, the Northwest chapter of the Sierra Club asked if I would found the Portland group of the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club's made up of chapters, and mostly statewide, but in California there's many of them. And the Northwest chapter covered Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, and part of British Columbia.
That's quite a distinction.
Yeah,
Honor to be
and
asked
now
to do that.
it's been broken into statewide operations since then. But it showed there was a small membership. It wasn't a large membership at that time.
Mhm.
So I founded and Bill helped me, the Portland group, the Sierra Club, which is prospering.
Is this all volunteer to begin with?
Oh
or-
yeah,
right.
and
Mhm.
get
Yeah.
paid for it.
Mhm.
It's all volunteer. I was working at Omark,
Mhm.
and so it gave me something useful to do that was more interesting than working at Omark.
Sure.
And then in 1968, the Northwest rep of the Sierra Club, Brock Evans, suggested that why don't we emulate what he had just successfully done in Washington, start Environmental Council. So suggested we put together an Oregon Environmental Council because we needed an indigenous conservation organization to press legislation and public policy, because the Sierra Club is looked at as an outsider. Californians trying to tell Oregonians what to do.
I'm sure that's a hot button issue, right?
Yeah, so 67, 68, we put it together and finally had about 80 organizations that belonged. It was politically became very potent. And I was back here in 69, about November, October, November 69. It was the time of one of the big Vietnam demonstrations, one of the largest demonstrations D.C. had seen. And I participated in that. And I was in the
Washington,
hotel
D.C.?
in D.C. Yeah, it was huge. I'd never seen that many people. Oregon, unbelievable. Patty says she participated in it, but I didn't see her.
Okay.
I was in the hotel, the Pick Lee, which doesn't exist, near DuPont Circle, and crying because the tear gas was coming through the windows,
Mm.
which were loose, and because there was a big confrontation in DuPont Circle with the anti-Vietnam protesters. I got a call from the president of the Sierra Club asking if I would take the job of being executive director. And I didn't have a job at that time. I left Omark, and I went to Heister Company, makes lift trucks and other stuff, and I found that a really unpleasant place to work. And so I left that. I was looking for something else to do. And since I didn't have another job, and really what I wanted to do was conservation work, it sounded like a good opportunity. The risk is that there was nobody making a living working conservation in Oregon. So I'd be the first person to try to do this. So they hired me at $10,000 a year, and after 2 years they owed me $10,000.
I had to raise.
It was up to me to raise the money.
Okay.
So most of my years at Oregon Environmental Council, I was paid $10,000 or maybe $12,000. But I didn't want to raise my salary very much because I could, my ability to bring in about $60,000 a year. That meant I didn't have much I could fund staff.
But it was up to you to go find people to fund this, huh?
Yeah, the board did almost nothing, so I had to figure out ways through the membership or whatever to get it. I made a slideshow, talked to Governor McCall, did promoting OEC, the Oregon Environmental Council, and took that around, showed it to Rotary clubs and so forth, and did mailings, and I wrote a bunch of radio advertisements and sent them to not Arthur Murray, what's his name, the famous radio.
Arthur Godfrey?
Godfrey, thank you, Arthur Godfrey. And he read the commercials for us and sent the tape back, so we sent those out to radio stations. Promote the organization. But that was a fun time, those years at OEC.
Well, the beginning of really following your passion.
Yeah, but it was sort of learning how to take an avocation, become a vocation, and a lot of hours and a lot of travel, both to Washington, but also just around the state, sleeping on people's couches, because I had no money to speak of. But we were deeply involved in the effort to create comprehensive land use planning Oregon, which passed through the support of Governor McCall and many organizations like OEC. And then we came up with the idea of a returnable bottle bill, which was the first in the nation. And we put in the bottle bill legislation, it took 2 sessions to get it through. Bottle industry hated it, of course.
They didn't want to see their bottles coming back, or what is it?
Well, the glass packaging industry.
Oh, they're the ones that hated it, sure.
Weren't going to sell as many glass bottles or plastic, whatever they were using, if this bottle went through. And the grocers weren't terribly excited about it either, getting the bottles back. But we put in the bill a provision that you could not sell carbonated beverage containers that had a detachable pull tab, which was a real hazard. And the industry went ballistic over that, said it couldn't be done, the typical reaction. So the Oregon Environmental Council pushed this idea, we got it through. For 6 months there were no canned soft drinks on the shelves except Shasta, which never did have a pull tab or
and open those with the old can opener.
Yeah, your can opener.
Yeah.
And as I've traveled the world, that law has spread almost every country in the world. I think I ran into, when I was making a speaking trip for U.S. Information Agency in Indonesia, they still had a detachable pull tab. And the young conservationists want to know what they could do, because confronting the government was very dangerous, and they didn't dare do that. So I said, what you could do is confront the bottling industry and push for non-detachable tabs. And I don't know if they did, but there are very few countries now that don't require that. So it's interesting how a local initiative like that can become
That's got to feel pretty wonderful.
Universal, adopted. So we spent a lot of time stopping bad logging practices and stopping bad dam proposals. The Corps of Engineers' motto was, any running river's a leak. And so, they were promoting dams here, right and left, and we managed to stop most of them.
Locally, Oregon
dams, which was always a struggle. And the industry, of course, the timber industry was predominant in Oregon.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so tackling that industry was very difficult. But we managed to get some Wheeler Series established, and
Was there a lot of resistance? I mean, just in the general public, or just was it the industry that really was?
well, no, the public wasn't terribly resistant, although it was the major industry for the state. So our primary place we got in the news in the Portland Oregonian was in the obituary page, because the Oregonian hated us. We took on the power structures, and for instance, the Portland Airport Authority decided it wanted to have equilateral simultaneous landings and takeoffs in the parallel runways, but it's up against the Columbia River, the airport. So they wanted to fill a square mile of the Columbia River to build a new runway. And we fought that, as the conservationists on the other side of the Columbia did, and they hired an attorney, and we worked with their attorney, and we got threatened that they were going to move the airport to St. Paul and out of the Portland area if we didn't relent and back off. So it was very tense, and the power structure of Oregon, especially Portland, was really upset by this. And finally, the Port Authority said, "Yep, you're right. We give up. We're not going to move it," and we won that.
Is that because it swung public opinion enough, or is it other
I don't know.
reasons?
I expect well, the whole idea of filling that much of the Columbia River was really appalling, and getting the proper dredging fill permits from the federal government, the Corps of Engineers. There was a case the Corps wanted to do dredging and put the dredge material on the wetlands along the Columbia, and we threatened to sue them over a violation of the National Environmental Policy Act. We put out a press release to that account, and the headline in the Portland Oregonian was "EPA threatens to sue over Columbia dredging." So I called our environmental reporter in the Oregonian and said, EPA isn't even mentioned in this story. What is this? They said, well, the editors could not stomach the idea of putting OEC in the headline of their newspaper. That's how much they disliked
Just
this.
like this, yeah. Because the newspaper, the owners were
Republican, conservative Republicans.
Yeah.
And then we took on the Trojan nuclear power plant. And that was probably the most difficult battle, that in Hell's Canyon. I guess we start with Hell's Canyon. It was an effort to dam one of the last free-flowing parts of the Snake River through the deepest canyon in America.
And where does the Snake River originate?
It originates in the upper Columbia. Well, it originates in Idaho. I mean, it comes down through Idaho and goes up, and I think drops into the Columbia.
Okay.
I frankly can't tell you where it actually comes from in Idaho. I should know, but I don't.
This is the upper part of the Snake that
So
you're
they
talking
wanted
about.
to dam this, and already, the Snake is heavily dammed. And so I worked with the Sierra Club on this. That was a campaign issue of theirs. And we fought that. I bet that took nearly 10 years of effort. Bob Packwood, Senator Packwood, when he became senator, joined us in support of stopping the dam. And Mark Hatfield, who was chair of the Interior Committee in the Senate, was very much in favor of the dam. And he had close friends in the power industry and the members of Idaho, of the Congress, who also wanted the dam. And that, then we had a local congressman that in the area that was chair of the Appropriations Committee in the House, and he, Ullman, and he wasn't exactly a leader in helping us either. So that was a tough nut, because we really had no support. We did get Governor McCall, for instance, didn't help us, but Governor Evans of Idaho came and testified in Washington for saving the canyon. And he and Packwood, Senator Packwood, are the only two people that really, in the political arena, that really were on our side. An amazing fact, we won that that.
So how do you think, how do you think, what kind of pressure was it that it took, or what?
Just relentless pressure, endless pressure, endlessly applied. And we were back here lobbying a lot on stopping that.
How did Pete Seeger play into that, or just a peripheral situation?
Well, it was basically peripheral.
Mhm.
My recollection is that Friends of the Earth put together the trip down to Snake, and I saw that there was happening and signed up. I wasn't invited specially or anything like that. It just came together that way. But Hatfield would not take a position for or against the dam. He basically stayed neutral, trying to play both sides,
Sure.
which he often did. Well, I called his office one day and talked to Jerry Frank, his chief of staff. I said, what in the hell's going on here? And Jerry very uncharacteristically said, well, Larry, you know that he plays golf every week with the senator, or the member representative from Idaho, who's very much in charge, favor of the dam, and it's unlikely he's going to support it. I said, okay. So I put out a press release basically stating that.
Oh, goodness.
And,
Oh, goodness.
and I was out of the office, and my secretary, Judy Hanson, was out sweeping the sidewalks. The phone rang. She comes in, and it's Hatfield on the line, who
Yeah.
was screaming at her.
I'll bet.
Furious, because we sent him a fax of it before we released it. And that caused him to support stopping the dam. He took a conservation position, as we all that he hated me for it, but we trapped
He
him.
felt too exposed.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. And so I got a call from another senior member of his staff yelling, screaming at me, how I dare do this. I made this up. And I said, no, I didn't make it up. This is what I was told. And then we had Al Ullman, the chair of the Appropriations Committee, who represented the district in the House of Representatives on the Oregon side. And he came up with a bill to save Hell's Canyon. It was clearly written by the Forest Service, and it basically let the Forest Service do anything the dam pleased. There was no management prescriptions to speak of. And the Hell's Canyon Reservation Council was ecstatic with excitement that this was happening. They were based in Idaho, that Ullman is actually going to support saving Hell's Canyon. Hatfield was. Well, I knew that if we let him go ahead with that, Hatfield would follow suit with the same bill, and there would be no way we could stop it. So I wrote a letter to Ullman and said, this is unacceptable. We can't accept this bill for these reasons. And published that widely, put it in our newsletter and so forth. Because I knew he was basically a coward. And he backed off and wrote a better bill. But the results of that, there's still many management problems because it wasn't as strong as we'd liked it, but that's the best we could have gotten. And Hell's Canyon Preservation Council still fights with the Forest Service on management problems in Hell's Canyon. But at least we were able to stop the dam. And in the meantime, Portland General Electric was deciding to build a nuclear power plant in St. Helens, Oregon. And St. Helens, where they wanted to site it, is right where the Columbia River turns due north and then turns back west, head for the ocean. And we thought, why does it do that? It seems likely there's a fault there to cause the river to make that big sharp turn.
Okay.
But we also did not want this nuclear power plant. But we had little information about the hazards of it. And the Atomic Energy Commission was the federal agency, and they were required to have public hearings in St. Helens on the project. And we were able to get a lawyer, pro bono, to represent us. And Judy, my secretary, and myself would spend evenings going through all the books we could find, writing questions about the safety of it. But there were areas which we couldn't ask about, like safety of radiation, safety of the health effects of radiation and so forth. They had a limited number of things you could approach them.
Okay.
And it turned out it was me and the lawyer and about 15 lawyers on the other side from the utility industry. And Atomic Energy Commission commissioners. And so the two of us trying to keep this, and lots of the public showed up, and they had their chance to testify against the project, best of their concern, most of them against it anyway. The Atomic Energy Commission gave me the green light, so we continued the pressure. One of the things we did, they had PG had a board meeting in Portland, and we found a member with stock, and we subdivided her stock and printed out certificates and put an ad in the paper. Anybody wanted a certificate, stock certificate, so they could attend the board meeting, we'd give it to them. So we got, I don't know, probably 100, 150 people with stock certificates.
Very subversive tactics.
Well, I had, on my way back from Washington one trip, I stopped in Chicago to visit the Saul Alinsky Institute. And I didn't meet Saul Alinsky. I'm not sure he was alive at that point. But trying to get some handle on what kinds of things I could do. And this was one of the things that came out of those discussions. The contingency was I got a noise permit for the area in front of the building, and then I found a band and with a flatbed truck, and we parked it in front of the building the night before. We set up a PA system and a band so that if they wouldn't let us in, we had a theater, a forum for the TV cameras. Well, PG decided it was better to let them in than, so we had both. We had the confrontation of the board and we had the theater out front. So that worked very well, and that further put pressure on PG. And then we threatened to go to court over this thing. They then relented and let, we had a geologist from Portland State University working with us, went ahead to do seismology tests. And it proved, this was big concession to them. They sort of said, okay, we drop your suit and we'll do the, because it's not illegal to build a nuclear power plant, but it was illegal to build it on a fault, or if there is one. So they said, okay, we'll do the tests. So we dropped the lawsuit, and they did the tests, and they couldn't find any fault. But that caused a big backlash for us, because a lot of people felt we just let them down because we dropped the lawsuit, not understanding that first you got to have an illegal activity in order to sue them, and there wasn't any other grounds really. And it was very expensive for us and very difficult.
Going up against people.
So that was a major disappointment, and a lot of people were unhappy. That plant turned out to be, we could have saved them a huge amount of money if they hadn't built it, because it turned out to be a white elephant. A lot of money put into building it. It ran only a few years, and now it's been shut down. They finally blew up the tower a couple of years ago.
I'm not sure if that's the plant Lyle visited. He used to have to go around to these plants, and I think he talked about that.
There's only one in Portland, Oregon, so it probably was. So they would have saved a lot of money and had built the thing. And then in 1975, 76, I suppose, when did Carter come into office? I don't know the name, what the year was. But Patty was working for the Environmental Protection Agency as the head of the legislative office. And when Carter came in, she felt that she'd lose her job because of change in parties.
Sure.
So she decided to come back to Portland. And
so left of her own accord.
Yeah. The transition was, as I recall, because Russ Train came to Portland. I had a speech that day at that event, and Patty came into the office looking for, not for the work necessarily for me, but working for ideas of where she might find a job in Oregon. The difficulty is that the kinds of positions she would hold are political appointee types jobs, and you've got to be part of the machine in order to get jobs that she'd be qualified for.
Sure.
She eventually got a job with Mel Gordon, who was a county commissioner for Multnomah County, and we moved into a house up in West Hills, Portland.
So that was, you had met her when now, precisely?
Well,
When she
right
first
after,
came in? I mean,
yeah, right after Carter came in,
Okay.
about that
but
time.
when she came into your office, that was the first
Yeah,
time
yeah,
you'd
that
seen her?
first time I met her.
Did
Yeah.
you have any, I mean, was it like somebody you were attracted to
Oh,
immediately?
yeah,
Uh-huh.
oh, yeah, she's a
Yeah.
very attractive lady and very bright,
Mhm.
and an amazing resume of what she had done, her career. So, I mean, she was very political and worldly, and which is hard to find in female companionships in
Yeah.
Oregon.
Right.
So she was a good match, turned out to be an excellent match.
Mhm.
So that went on a couple of years, and she helped Mel Gordon get a job on the Columbia River Basins Commission, the federal commission, but he didn't ask her to join him. So she was out without work. So she, and I had been out traveling, and we came back and decided to go to a movie. We were standing out on the street waiting to get into this movie theater. She turns to me and says, "I'm going back to Washington." Sort of out of the blue.
Mhm.
And it was like a Woody Allen movie because the people in front and the back sort of got involved in the conversation. What? You're doing what? You know. But
What are you gonna say to her?
yeah, yeah, and so I contacted my friends with the executive director of the Sierra Club, Mike McCloskey, and the Northwest rep of the Sierra Club, Doug Scott, and others, and said, I need a job in Washington. Well, it turns out a perfect job was opening up, and it was a public lands policy analyst for the Council on Environmental Quality, which is a part of the Executive Office of the President. And so Patty went back looking for work, and I went to Washington with her and dropped in, so to speak, because they would never have paid my way for an interview.
Mhm.
And met with the chairman and others.
You were able to get in and get these.
Get
these
the interview,
meetings.
yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine, George Alderson, was putting his name in. He was working for Bureau of Land Management in Washington, which I thought was fairly unfriendly. He did that too. But they hired me because they liked the fact I'd been hands-on working public lands in Oregon and not just in D.C. So I got hired for that. So
And Patty.
Patty came still looking for work.
Okay.
She got a job at the Financial Accounting Standards Board as the Washington representative. It sets accounting standards for the industry. And she had those leads but didn't have a job at the time when we came. But she soon landed that job when we got here. So I announced to the Oregon Environmental Council I was moving to Washington. It would have been very hard for me to move if I didn't have a job.
Right.
I mean, how would you
Yeah.
explain this? Because I was fairly high profile politically. So my friend Bill Nordstrom opened his house to a farewell party, and Governor McCall came, and State Treasurer Straub came to the party. One of them upstairs, the other downstairs, because they were running against one another for governor. But they both came, and other people came. It was a really wonderful party. And what happened is that I convinced her we should get married before we moved. And so we got married in the house on Saturday, and had the party Saturday night or Sunday, and left for Washington on Wednesday, which meant the house had to be packed up.
Had you found a place here already?
No,
Okay.
no. Well, Charlie Warren, the chairman of the CEQ, wanted me to immediately come to Washington, and I said, I can't leave Patty to pack and do that. That wouldn't be fair.
Mhm.
He said, oh, okay, and so I said, we need 2 weeks. So we went to the Caribbean and had a mini honeymoon.
Good.
And before we came back here, we found a by the week apartment downtown, and then stumbled across a house close by to where we're living now, which we rented for a year. The money was so short, houses, you couldn't get money to buy a house until that market opened up. About
Financing,
2 years,
you mean,
yeah,
yeah.
couldn't get financing.
Mhm.
So we bought this house at 14.5%.
Things were kind of tough at that point, weren't
Very
they?
tough, yeah.
Huge. Gas rationing and all that.
Yeah, that's true too.
Mhm.
And, we brought that down, we paid off the house now. But that's how it all basically came together. And then when Carter left office, Reagan came in and he fired the whole staff of Council on Environmental Quality, but he couldn't get rid of the agency because it was congressionally mandated.
Okay.
It wasn't an executive order.
So you could fire the staff and still have the
Yeah,
agency?
can't get rid of the agency. So it happened to be staffed again, and a few secretaries were left, but that's about it. But you lost all the
Is
policies.
this part of his anti-regulation movement, or what?
Just anti-environment.
Environment, yeah.
Yeah. Yet, you know, he's the guy who, or I should say, he's the guy. Nixon's the guy who established EPA and
Mhm.
Safe Drinking Water Act and.
Republicans had a
Clean
little
Water
different
Act.
mandate back in
And
those
so,
days.
yeah, and so here's a new Republican coming in and wanted to get rid of all those things.
Mhm.
So I, having been close to the Sierra Club, they hired me originally to lobby the appropriations process to save the gutting of EPA's budget, which is a very hard job because people on appropriations are generally very secure politically and very hard to move.
Mm.
And very difficult to even get near. But the chair of the committee overseeing Environmental Protection Agency wrote the budget and basically gutted the EPA's budget. And I went to Tim Worth and we worked it out, and he challenged the chair of the appropriations, the appropriations subcommittee, on the floor of the Senate, which is really gutsy because the Cardinals do not like to be challenged, and if you want a
public,
favor from
right.
them, you know, forget it if you've done this.
Right.
And in fact, Tim Worth won, and we got Tip O'Neill to go visit Bolin and say, you know, we do not want you, I don't want you to promote this legislation, this budget numbers. And Bolin practically threw him out of his office, says, that's not your business. And
Tip O'Neill.
even though they'd roomed together, they were
Uh-huh.
friends. But what happened in conference is that Bolin basically ignored the House mandate, went with the cuts. But we made a good try, but we did hold off some of the worst cuts.
Mhm.
And then I was given the job of helping the Sierra Club point person on reauthorization of the Clean Water Act. And in that act, we were able to get the separation of stormwater runoff, which was a huge fight with the cities who didn't want to spend the money and didn't like the idea, but we got that in the law.
Moving that out of the sewer system.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you know, old cities, you separated stormwater isn't possible. So what's Washington doing right now as a result of that law? They're building these huge underwater storage tanks. So when you have a major rainfall,
Mhm.
the overflow goes into these tanks rather than directly into the Potomac as it does now, or into the Anacostia.
Mhm.
And then when the storm's over, they can pump those dry and process them in the filtration plants. Thereby saving them going into the river. So that's how that is being implemented here and probably other places.
Well, I have a friend that works precisely in that in
Yeah.
the community of Savage. He handles
Yeah.
stormwater runoff, and we have
Yeah.
all kinds of wetland provisions here for where water has to be directed into these holding ponds. And it's pretty amazing.
So that, we got some other things. We got anti-backsliding. If a polluting plant closed down, the state was not allowed to repollute the river to that level again. And that took some convincing, but we were able to finally get that in that reauthorization too. And once that passed, and then Reagan vetoed the bill, so it had to be repassed the next session, but that wasn't a big deal. I was asked to take over the international program of Sierra Club. The international program, such as it was based in New York, focused on the UN. Had no connection to membership and grassroots.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to lobby the UN and make any difference.
Yeah.
So they said, would you take it over in Washington and develop a program? Well, what do you do with one person? And
Internationally.
so, well, it turned out that National Wildlife Federation and Friends of the Earth and Environmental Defense Fund and Natural Resource Defense Council were all working on reforming the lending practices of the World Bank, the multilateral institutions, which there are regional ones around the world too. And that seemed like a logical place for us to go. So we took on the policies of the World Bank, which encourage logging in rainforests and exploitation of resources in order to pay, to raise the economy in a country
In the sense they provided funding to help these
Yep,
things happen.
yeah, building dams where they shouldn't be and that sort of thing. The IMF, for instance, when Brazil was in economic trouble, suggested they junk their endangered species law so they could export more endangered species and cut more timber.
Sure.
Because they didn't give a shit about that. They're economists. They thought about it. But we had strong support from Treasury to help us with that, because World Bank, the executive directors from the United States to the World Bank are controlled by Treasury. So the policies that executive directors take, Treasury Department clears. And Treasury was run by Baker, who was very pro-environment and was very helpful.
And how influential the U.S. was
Well,
quite influential on the World Bank.
Yeah, the U.S. is the major funder, was then, I'm not sure how it is now, of the World Bank. So our U.S. position was very much important. Now, you can't legislate the World Bank anymore. You can legislate the UN because it's a multilateral institution. But the U.S. had a lot of sway. I came up with the idea of implementing an environmental assessment process at the banks, much like our National Environmental Policy Act, which would require the banks to do environmental assessment of the project before they could implement it. Around that time, the executive director of the Sierra Club, Carl Pope, called me and said, "We have a new member of Congress from San Francisco, and she wants to do, work with the Sierra Club, but she's on the banking committee of the House. And do you think you can come up with anything that she might, involve herself in? She'd like to be helpful." Her name was Nancy Pelosi. And so when I came up with this idea, I went over and visited her staff and suggested that we might do something like this and drafted an idea of a bill. And she met with me and talked about it and said, "We'll think about it." And came back to me and says, "Yeah, I think that's something we could do." And so we sent the bill to legislative drafting, and they came back with a formal bill. And she was on the banking committee, which it would have to go through. And the chair of the banking committee was the delegate from Washington D.C. So we got members of the D.C., even though he was only a delegate, he was chair of that,
Just happened to be
to lobby him to support this bill, and he told him, "Oh yes, that's a great idea." But in private he said he'd vote against it. So Nancy says, "Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, you've feeling that way because I have the majority of the votes." So he flipped his position.
Yeah.
We got the bill through that committee and put her as a writer on other continuing resolutions, and got it through the House. And then Paul Sarbanes was chair of the Finance Committee in the Senate, and close friend of Nancy's, and she'd done a lot of fundraising for him. And he said, "Hell no, I'm not going to support that." And she came back just stunned. After all I've done for him. So somehow, through her staff and her very big talent, she was able to wrestle this bill through the Senate.
Isn't that something?
And get it passed. The meantime, Treasury Department was ballistic, and they called me at night, the Assistant Secretary of Treasury, said, "You can't do this, this is awful, the world comes in." Because the law said, if passed, the U.S. could not vote for a project if environmental assessment had not been written.
Mhm.
And the Treasury Department thought they would be hamstrung and they would be no longer able to vote on important projects, and this would make them inept. I said, not likely. World Bank is not going to risk losing the funding of the United States.
Mhm.
But they were very short-sighted on that, and
Was there specific specific, what am I looking for here, with regarding an environmental assessment? Was there specific standards that had to be met with that assessment, or was this just kind of a?
No, it doesn't set standards. Basically, it's a full disclosure process.
Okay.
And what it did is it opened up the project to public scrutiny in the country. And many countries didn't have environmental agencies. So it forced them to adopt and set up an environmental agency. Others that did have them, they never were told. The president would work with the Treasury, probably the Treasury Secretary or whatever, in that particular country that they were set up. And it would never, the information that they were planning on building this dam or whatever would never get to the environmental people because they had no power, and who cares?
Mhm.
And so they never heard about these things. Suddenly, they were consulted and ended up having to be involved in writing the assessment. And so it really brought democracy and decision-making into the process, which it did in the U.S. Congress really didn't know what it passed when it passed NEPA. It was vitally important as a public policy and democratization of decision-making.
All over the world.
And it spread.
Yeah.
My colleagues in the other environmental organizations did not support this effort. In fact, they threatened to oppose it because we're imposing U.S. law on the rest of the world. And I said, look, it's 76 countries already adopted policies similar to what we've got. So this is hardly a new idea. They sort of backed off and said, okay, we won't oppose it. So they did nothing.
If you don't have it here, we're sort of imposing environmental degradation on the rest of the world with our money, right?
Well,
So,
that's
yeah.
exactly, you got a good point. So it turned out to be a boon to the activists in countries and all the whole policy-making process within these countries. Now, whether it stopped the worst of worst, it's a mixed bag, but at least it's a step forward. And that was probably one of the more important things I was able to get through. I also did some things. I got provision through that 3% of the Agency for International Development's budget had to be spent on natural resources. The agency was furious about this. I got screamed at from that, and it got passed, and the staff loved it, and now it's a much bigger percentage is spent on natural resources. But my thought was, how in the hell are you going to be in the business of international aid if you ignore the environmental consequences of what you're doing or not paying attention to it? And it was not on their agenda, and now it became, through staff support, very much on their agenda. So that was another thing that I was able to do. So you could tinker around and do some things in Congress those years.
Get them through before people sort of realize what they were passing too, or what it is.
Sometimes.
You don't know what the ramifications are ever going to be on these things.
Yeah.
So it's
ripples. But sometimes these small steps can make big difference.
Exactly.
And so those were fun things to do.
Yeah.
I developed a program in which I was given. I did not ask for the population program. Sierra Club had a population program. It goes way back. The only environmental group that did. Most environmental groups did not equate the population explosion with environment, which is short-sighted. So I had ministered that program, and then we got into the NAFTA debate in North American Free Trade, and Sierra Club strongly opposed that without environmental controls. And so I hired a staff person to work on that. And it's a trade, and we still have a trade campaign. And then one of my assistants, Steve Mills, developed the idea of human rights in the environment and helping protect people that speak out in foreign countries for protecting the environment.
There you
And
go.
he was instrumental in saving a captain of a submarine who blew the whistle on the fleet in the North Sea that was in storage in a nuclear fleet that was polluting the North Sea. And they
So he blew the whistle. But
Soviet Union arrested him as a spy or a traitor or whatever, tried to try him, and Steve got very much involved in that, and some other environmental activists around the world. That program didn't survive because the Goldman Foundation finally stopped funding it, and no other environmental foundation felt that they wanted to support that effort, which is too bad.
Well, and many of these activists are at huge risk in the countries they're in.
Yeah, and it needs to be done still. And the Goldman Prize goes on, but there's no environmental organization working on helping people anymore. So that aspect collapsed. And the World Bank campaign, or the multilateral development campaign, sort of came to an end too.
And these are in what years? Who was?
Well, that would have been, I don't know, years are hard to come by.
Right. What president administrations do you think they were?
Well, it would have been under Clinton. We did quite well, and we had a lot of support from the White House. I worked closely with the White House on the campaign, and then Bush came in, and I came up. There was a bill going through Congress which I learned about belatedly. It was part of the funding for the Inter-American Development Bank, which is basically the bank that works with Latin America. And it would forgive the debt owed to the U.S. And part of that forgiveness money would go in local money to support conservation efforts in that country. And it would be controlled, the money would be controlled by the government, and the government would decide how to spend that money. And I had a meeting in the castle, actually, in the board of directors room of the castle, with the environmental community, and it turns out it was an initiative by the World Wildlife Fund, and basically the money would fall into their pockets. They basically developed this. I said, this doesn't make a lot of sense. What we should do is see that this money goes to the NGOs, and they set up a board situation where the government's represented, but also NGOs to spend the money. Because money is power. That would empower the NGOs and not just go to an American organization to do what needed to be done. Oh boy, Bill Riley was at that point. He used to be head of EPA, and he called up my boss and screamed at him how I got in the way of World Wildlife Fund, and I was really the devil. And we got it through and it became law. But then the Congress decided in order to forgive the debt, they had to appropriate the money, which is a strange way you look at it. And they never did appropriate the money to forgive the debt, so these countries couldn't write it off. So it never really worked. But it shows sort of the background of politics on the Hill and how you can get involved and do some things that are creative and interesting. And then when the club stopped really funding, helped me find money for the bank campaign, and would not let me use hard money, which is the money that comes in that's not tax deductible. And I needed hard money in order to move the legislative process, because the only leverage we had was the Congress, with the support of administration or the Treasury Department, on legislation to push the banks into greater reform. And if I couldn't use any hard money, then I had no leverage. I could write letters to the bank, but what good is that going to do? So I finally said, well, I left the club at that point. What was that, 98 or something like that? Yeah. And then I worked on a project in Uganda with a friend to see if we could set up a shade-grown coffee project. It was money came from the...
what kind of coffee project?
Shade-grown. In other words, growing coffee in a biodiversity, rich habitat. Habitat is rich in biodiversity. Meant that the tree cover is still intact for the wildlife protection. And the project was funded by the Global Environmental Fund, the GEF, which is part of the World Bank. So we'd gone to with him and looked at the project, and he wanted to harvest wild coffee from Kabale National Forest, National Park. And then the local people would process the coffee and package it. And I did that. That lasted maybe a year, maybe less, and he ran out of money on it. And then it turns out there wasn't enough wild coffee to sustain the project,
Okay.
so it didn't really take off. And then in 2004, I was asked by the Asian Development Bank to come to the Philippines and be on an inspection panel. So one of the things the environmental community did was set up inspection panels at each of the banks, where you had citizen complaints about a project and how it was managed. They were forced to put together these oversight panels, could look at those allegations and see if the bank indeed followed its own rules.
Right.
So this was one of those. This was a panel that was set up by the Asian Development Bank, and they'd always been very friendly because they helped me get the Pelosi amendment through on EIAs, convincing Nancy this was a good idea and they could do it. So they were fairly progressive. So I got to know the bank staff. So I spent, I don't know, 3 months in the Philippines, sort of being imprisoned, dreadful, Manila, dreadful place, looking at a project that was in Pakistan, which is a huge irrigation project, the world's largest, I guess, on the Indus River, building an irrigation canal down through the country. And this was what was called stage 3 of this irrigation canal. And they decided environmental assessment wasn't necessary because it didn't have any impact because it was all desert, who cares?
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, and it had a lot of impacts. So we wrote a fairly critical piece on what the bank, all the violations the bank undertook. And so that was about 4 months it took, 3 or 4 months it took to do that. I came home for some of it. The only good thing was I got to Pakistan. We had to get UN sanctions to be able to go. And Pakistan didn't want us to go very badly.
Sure.
But it was a long struggle. Finally, they relented. We could have written the report without going because we had all the documentation, and we weren't looking at how Pakistan was behaving. We were looking at how the bank behaved.
Right.
But it helped legitimize what we were writing if we could visit. So we visited the equivalent of the Corps of Engineers and their staff, and traveled that part of the Indus River, and visited the way out in the boonies in these little town communities.
That were going to be impacted by this if it went through.
Yeah, well, the thing was built.
Okay.
So it was how were they impacted and how were
Okay.
they treated,
Got
that
it.
sort of thing. And of course, we had that huge rainfall and flood last year, was it, or was it 2 years, in which it comes off the mountain range right into the Indus, and I think it probably exacerbated the problem having this canal there because it blocked the ability of the river to water to drain off into
sure.
the river. So that was the last paying job I had. But it was interesting job.
Yeah.
So made for an interesting career. Lots of
Fascinating
fun things to do.
career.
Yeah.
And it sounds like politics really got into your blood. At a
Oh,
certain
yeah.
point.
I
Yeah.
mean, once you learn you can make change,
Yeah.
it's like eating peanuts.
Well, then it's a chess match too, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you're just this give and take and trying to understand what the next moves might be made about the
Right.
opponents, or who you
Right.
can sway and what you have to help sway them.
Well,
Fascinating. Yeah.
and having representing the Sierra Club, which has an active organization in every congressional district in the nation, meant you had access to members of Congress, and you had an ability to move politics, and members listened to the club. So that made a huge difference in how your effectiveness in the Congress.
Right.
I'm sure glad I'm not an obvious there nowadays, though. I don't, because in those days, Republicans were very, very much willing to work with the Democrats and solve big problems and be responsive. But nowadays, it's so polarized. It's got to go back.
Where do you think that began to really get bad?
Well, it was under Reagan, and remember the K Street project in which the House decided that all lobbyists had to be Republicans, and no Democrats could lobby the Republicans in the House. And that was largely, I think, look at it, the beginning of this polarization.
Is that still true? I mean,
No,
oh, okay.
no.
That,
That was sort of the beginning of the hate thy opponents sort of process, and it got worse and worse. And then, you know, a lot of people decided that being cooperative and working with the Democrats was a selling out on their side. You hear that today, and that's still a real problem. But interesting enough, the highway bill went through, which was a compromise. So that broke down, and there was a article in yesterday's paper how some members are refusing to sign the no tax pledge.
Okay.
So maybe things are starting to break down a little bit.
this Grover Norquist initiative.
Yeah, I have the hopes that we'll see a replay of what we saw with Goldwater, in that he lost badly, and that caused the Republican Party to shift around dramatically. But I don't know if it's in the cards.
And what'll happen?
Romney could well win the White House, and the Republicans could well win the Congress. And that means they would probably be appointing a new Supreme Court justice, given the age of the Democrats in the Supreme Court. So let's hope that doesn't happen.
Right. Do you see a real distinction between the way the Democrats handled their understanding of Republicans and how to work with them versus how the Republicans view Democrats?
Well, I think the Democrats have generally been willing to work with Republicans, but they're not willing to buy off on sort of the wacky ideas of cutting money to environmental protection and things that are important for public safety and public good.
Right.
So that leaves a stalemate, and then of course we got into that fight over the debt ceiling.
Right.
Which it seemed to me that, you remember there was a lot of talk in the 14th Amendment which says nothing shall interfere with the U.S. paying its debt.
Right.
And it seemed to me, being no expert in the issue, but it seemed like the experts said that indeed that meant the Congress could not refuse to pay its bills. And Obama didn't buy into that.
Yeah, I remember that.
I think he could have said, I'm going to ignore the debt ceiling, I think it's unconstitutional, we're going to pay our debts, and let the Supreme Court decide. And that meant the whole thing would have blown over, it would have dragged on for another year, let the Supreme Court get a hold of it, and then it would come up again through the Supreme Court. And he may or may not have won that, I don't know, but it would have gotten through that
period. Right.
And he didn't do it.
Yeah, that
And
really
he said,
held
why?
things up.
What was the downside? You know, maybe I don't understand the situation well enough, but disappointing. Opportunities like that he lost sometimes.
Yeah.
Do you think Obama's made some mistakes?
Well, not being aggressive enough. He's certainly good intentions. I think he could be more aggressive in the health care bill. Not that he didn't get it passed, but he was fairly passive in letting the Democrats control the debate, and he sat back and sort of let them. Glad the health care bill got through.
Yeah, me too, and I hope it sticks, and I hope we can get through the.
Well, if Romney gets elected,
yeah,
who knows?
Who knows
By that time, more and more of the public will understand its benefits, so it may not be quite as easy as he thinks it is to repeal.
Right. Certainly, it's a hypocrite on that whole issue with regard to his setup in Massachusetts. So.
Yep. That's really awkward. He basically it's the same legislation. But he's catering to the right wing, and that's a danger because the right wing are not going to elect the president. It's going to be the moderates in the middle.
What's your take on the Tea Party? Are they here to stay?
No, I think it's like the Sagebrush Rebellion and the rest of them, that it will blow over. It's already beginning to.
It's just too radical, right?
Yeah, that far off extreme. It'll be around, but I don't think it'll have the kind of sway that it has had. I mean, the Americans are basically very much the middle of the road, and Goldwater was rejected as being too radical in one way, and public Democrats have had the same problem, being too liberal in other ways. So,
right.
so the more moderation And how Romney's going to be able to get there, we'll see.
But in this upcoming situation, that Republicans seem to have a lot more solid base congressionally.
Well, they certainly have the money
Mm-hmm.
and the ability because they're catering to the moneyed class.
Right.
So that makes it really an advantage to them in fundraising.
How do you see the impact of money in this country on politics changing over time?
I wish it would change. It's terribly corrupting.
Yeah. Is it more corrupt? Do you see it getting more and more that way?
Well, yeah, I mean, given the Supreme Court ruling,
Mm-hmm.
we should have public funding of campaigns.
Right.
And we also should have a much reduced ad rate in the public televisions and the national television networks. After all, those are public airways,
Right.
and they make billions off these campaigns.
That's obscene.
But again, the politics are such, you probably won't see either.
Mm-hmm.
But the corrupting influence of money, I mean, these members are running constantly every day to earn enough money to be able to run again.
Right.
And it just shouldn't be that way.
And what you have to give in order to get that money in terms of
You got time and
political-
effort.
well,
Time and effort. And
views.
and votes and views, yeah.
Views, right.
Yeah.
Mhm. And it's sort of exponential in the way that works here. The more the money, more money comes into that, the more influence there is.
So how do you get around, how do you break the back of this monkey, this money monkey? I don't know.
Well, then Occupy Wall Street was a sort of odd attempt, but it looked
Well, it had
some
it
potential
had
at
no
first.
focus. It got
Yeah.
some. It had no focus.
right.
No action handle, which people could say, yes, we need that.
Because it seems like grassroots is what's going to have to happen for this kind of change to occur.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And yet, it's very difficult for the grassroots to move this. It really needs leadership from the president and Congress. And good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very troubling, and it's distorting the democracy badly.
What year did you your last work?
Oh, I guess it was 98.
98?
So 99,
Okay.
98, yeah.
So you've had your time to yourself since then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how's it being out of that political arena?
Well, I stayed I was chair of the International Committee, Citizens Committee for a number of years. Then on a four-person committee that cleared policy between the Sierra Club of Canada and the U.S. on international affairs.
Oh.
That happened until just a few months ago when they got rid of that committee. I don't know what the club's going to do next. So
I didn't know
I've
there
been
was-
involved in the club right along up until the last few months.
I didn't know Sierra Club was in Canada. Is
Yeah.
that- I
It's
didn't
a
know-
small organization. It's been there many years.
Okay.
It's never grown very big. It's a fairly small organization.
What kind of membership do they have nationally?
You know, I honestly don't know. It's I have not heard
Okay.
what, because the recession really, most of the nonprofits really got hurt
Yeah.
in the recession. So
Sure,
I don't know
of
what the
course.
size is of the club now. But, it's doing well. It's got, Bloomberg gave it a huge amount of money for clean coal campaign,
Oh.
global warming,
Mhm.
part of the climate change project. So they've got a large staff working on the whole climate change issue.
Mhm, mhm. So you don't have a foot in at this point. You're sort of out of the whole thing.
First time since I was a kid,
Yeah.
you know, my teens, that I am not really involved in the club anymore. Yeah.
Well, it's quite a story from your beginnings.
Yeah.
With the struggle with educationally, with learning, that sort of thing, to move
Yeah.
into this,
Yeah, well,
which is.
it turned out to be a good fit.
Yeah.
Rather than being academic. Yeah.
Mhm.
But,
Well, you certainly come from an academic background. I think those skills sort of come naturally to you anyway.
maybe so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
But I was never like David, where he was very accomplished.
what was
So
that like,
forth.
having a brother that was, I don't know when it was discovered that he had this sort of genius IQ, but did you know that he was looked on as being the bright one when you were
Oh,
young?
yeah. Oh, yeah. And parents put money into his college education, which I didn't get any, not that I could stay in college anyway.
Did you have some feelings about that at the time?
Not strong. I thought he deserved it, whatever. He worked hard for it.
Uh-huh.
He worked, I think at Dredges out in the Pacific Coast, earned money in the summer. So he didn't live off my parents by any means.
Uh-huh.
and Reed College is pretty expensive college.
Sure.
His big mistake is getting his degree in philosophy. God knows why, but because I don't know how you know what do
What
you
you make
do?
a living with
Yeah,
that,
how do you make a living? But that, of course, wasn't a concern of a lot of good college students at the time.
Oh, liberal arts. I mean, the
Liberal
idea of
arts.
getting a broad
That's
education.
right, arts
right?
and whatever, science, whatever.
Yeah.
And so it never really became an issue as a college. And then, you know, to his credit, he got this job, and I don't know how he managed it at University Berkeley, in the University of California. And it was an administrative job. I don't know much about what he did. He told me he was deeply involved in setting up Davis College,
Okay.
and getting that going. And,
So he left, I mean, when he left home, you sort of didn't have, the contact really changed with him, right?
yeah, I didn't have much even through his Reed College years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he wasn't home most of the time, so I didn't see him.
Right.
Yeah.
And then growing up in the earlier years, you say he was 4 years ahead of you, that your relationship
Yeah.
wasn't.
Not close particularly,
Right.
but then he, you know, he got involved in the People's Park in Berkeley, and that was his downfall as a career in California.
From a political standpoint with regard to his job, or just,
Yeah,
yeah?
yeah. Reagan made sure he got fired because he was opposing the university policies. And Country Joe and the Fish and others raised money for him for a legal offense, and the university lost, and he was hired again, but they didn't give him anything to do. Yeah. And Elizabeth was working at the college there too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they met. So once he found he didn't have any work to do, they left and went to bed. He didn't work since after that.
Right. But you, Elizabeth and David were back in Portland for a bit, right?
This is Elizabeth I we're talking
Okay,
about.
Elizabeth, yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right, and I'm skipping over that. They
Yeah.
did come back to Portland and they lived with us for a while.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I frankly don't know what David did for a living at that time. I can't remember.
Those are times Liz, my mother, talks about very fondly,
Yeah.
of you,
Yeah.
spending time with you. She
That's
really
nice.
adored you, so still
That's
does.
nice
So
of her.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It
Well,
was-
she adored the whole
yeah.
family. She
Yeah.
loved, and she loved
Yeah.
Carol so much. So
And my parents were really great people.
yeah,
But it was sort of a tight living because it was a small house, and
Sure.
they were basically living in the basement. And I was living in the basement too.
okay,
And so it was a little tight fit.
I'll bet.
Well, my parents were very generous about that.
Yeah.
And, but I don't remember what he did for a living there, or
No.
what Liz did.
Yeah, those were in the years, Liz never worked, and the years when that kind of stuff
Yeah,
still
you
happened.
might ask her what
Right.
what
She
they did at that
right,
time.
because of that time,
Yeah.
yeah. But when they moved on from there, let's say they were in Portland, I know we had a house in Portland, I think, for a while. I'm not sure, I know we moved to Salem at some point, so.
Okay, well, you're ahead of me. You had a house in Portland?
I don't know for sure, I mean, wherever I was
Okay.
born, so
Okay.
56.
Yeah, yeah.
I was
Okay.
born in Portland, and then Kenneth
Yeah.
was born in Salem,
In
so.
Salem, yeah.
Mhm.
And that all is sort of a blank to me. I
Mhm.
don't have much memory of
Sure.
that. And I did go back to Minneapolis when Dave and Liz were still together,
Okay.
and visited them. Took a bus from Portland to Minneapolis.
Oh, my.
That was in the middle of winter.
Would they been living in their apartment at that point? in
No, that
time?
house.
In a house, okay,
Yeah,
the house
probably.
on 4th
Probably.
Street, yeah,
Probably the same house I
Yeah,
still have,
that's right.
yeah.
Actually, the house is gone now,
Oh,
but,
oh,
yeah.
really? Yeah, so I went out and spent a week with them, so.
Yeah, yeah. See, but you didn't, I mean, your lives went in separate tracks, so there was.
Very much.
Yeah, right,
No, he had very different interests than I did.
Mhm.
so.
yeah. Did you have any thoughts or feelings about him leaving Berkeley and what happened, going to Bend, where you didn't really, just leading his life, right?
Yeah, he was alive, his
Mhm.
choice. So,
Right.
um,
I mean, was there any concerns at any point that something was happening with him, or?
well, it was, I think, even at that time, obviously, he got very much into the drug scene.
Mhm.
And so that was not conducive to holding down work.
Right, right.
And
This is quite a step down to go to Bend
Yeah, and I don't know why they picked Bend.
and drive a taxi cab or whatever it was he was doing.
Whatever he did there, I don't know,
Right.
you know, why he just chose Bend, except maybe Ken Kesey and that influence, must have had something to do with it, I
Sure.
suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did Ken Kesey go to band?
I don't think so, but
Eugene.
Eugene, it was Oregon, it was that, you know, the flower children at the
Right.
time.
Right.
Why Bend was particularly important, not quite sure.
Mhm.
But housing may have been cheaper there than most places too, I suppose.
And it turns out, I mean, did you find out later on that there were issues, mental health issues for him, or is that something?
Yeah, that was about right later on, or during that time.
Yeah.
I realized that he had bipolar. Elizabeth apparently never knew it.
Okay.
I just don't think it was obvious.
Yeah, well, in those days it wasn't diagnosed as much either.
Didn't know much about it.
Much
Yeah.
about it, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Did he go on medication sometimes?
Yeah, that's what I understand.
Mhm.
He apparently
So when he
did.
was on medication, he got more calm and,
Don't-
Probably, but
Okay,
I,
you weren't
I
around
wasn't
him.
around to know.
Right.
But I gather he didn't stay on it, which is pretty typical, I guess.
It is.
Yeah. But
And what killed him ultimately? It was a heart attack? So
I don't think it was ever an autopsy, but
Okay.
probably a heart attack.
Okay.
He was at folks' apartment in Milwaukee.
So he was visiting.
Yeah, and he drowned basically. Yeah,
That's
had a
such
heart attack.
What a shock for.
Yeah,
your
part of
parents.
my parents, my
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, for everyone, but what a shock for them to be right there
yeah,
at home.
poor Christopher. Oh, he lost
Oh.
his mother and his father. But Christopher, I'm sure, was quite worried about what was going to happen because he had no means of support.
Right. Well,
And,
I just, I mean, even knowing, even visiting when I did in '75 here, it wasn't the most stable situation. You
Yeah.
could see that.
so my parents were basically supporting him. And
Mhm.
Christopher was concerned, I'm sure, about how this was going to work out over the long term.
What age was he at the time? Wasn't 85. You say he's 38?
He's 38, 39 now.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So he was in Portland and working for the computer industry
Oh, okay.
at the time. His father passed away. So.
And the two other kids that, was it Allison? Is that what
Yeah,
I
Christopher keeps track of Allison. I think the other one, Jeffrey. I think it
Jeffrey,
is.
okay.
Yeah, he keeps track of them. I don't have any. I haven't met them
Mhm.
more than once in my life, I
Sure.
suppose,
Yeah.
if that.
Yeah.
I knew of them, so he keeps track of them.
Mhm.
But he's turned out to be very, very good citizen.
Yeah, and able to manage
Very
his situation,
successful.
which is
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
And growing up in that very difficult environment, it's really impressive how well he's done.
Yes. Yep.
So you were lucky. You had a pretty stable life.
Very lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah. But still a little unusual, It's divorce is never a simple
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
And,
Oh, yeah.
Part of your heritage, especially in my case, really gets cut off for reasons beyond my control.
I know. Luckily, I didn't ever live through anything like that.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not that it was a traumatic divorce for me. I was young, and the transition was rather smooth because they were both that were in my life, and there was
Sure. Yeah.
no tension. There was nothing happening in terms of a
Yeah.
tense breakup.
Right.
But
Right.
still I have those regrets, I guess. That I couldn't
Yeah,
have had
well-
another relationship. So life is such. Deal with what you're handed.
It's been a good life.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you inviting us out here.
Well, it's been wonderful to meet both of you.
Yeah.
And, it's too bad it took so long.
Yeah, well, I have to take some responsibility for that.
You need to make some connection.
She pushed me a little bit, and that helps. So.
Get some connection with Christopher, who you
Yes,
like very
that's
much.
my next step. I got to go against my introverted nature here to push these
He's
things.
a very nice guy.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
And he's somewhat introverted too. He's not going to reach out. You'll have to
Okay.
reach to him. But
All right.
he's well worth the effort.
I'm going to make the effort,
Yeah.
and then we can report back and compare notes.
And
So,
it's important to him to know his
yeah.
history too. He
Well,
hasn't shown as much interest as you have in that, but he basically grew up with the folks and family more, so he was closer to that all that.
So you would know a
And you
lot
would,
too, fill in
yeah.
a lot.
Yeah.
I think it's something that happens as we get older, if it's going to happen at all here, that this becomes more important. So
Mm-hmm.
That's what I've noticed.
Yep.
So, yeah.
You start paying attention.
Mhm,
In your youth, you didn't really care too much.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Is there anything you would ask, Paul, that I haven't thought of? Okay.
Done a nice job. Thank you
Good.
very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Rock-a-bye, my baby, somewhere there may be a land that's free for you and me, and a Russian lullaby.